Welcome to a new episode of Tales and Tactics, Tales of Lore, where we dive deep into the stories that shape our worlds for our favorite role-playing games, and war games, and could be anything, really. But more of a focus on the narrative and story side of things. I am your host, of course, Max, and joining me is my co-host, Troy, and working behind the scenes is our producer, Jay. Today's episode is the first episode in this series about a specific setting, which I decided last minute was the thing we were going to do. And that is something that has grown on me throughout my exploration of many settings and games, which is the Warhammer Fantasy setting, which I have grown to love quite a lot. Where I had originally started, I wouldn't say that I disliked it, because there were lots of things I did like about it. I liked the aesthetic of it.
Yeah.
I liked the kind of quirky mixture of humor and darkness and something of it's boots on the ground, kind of like in realism, but not really. I could always tell that it had this strange verisimilitude to it. Not to say that it didn't always adhere to that, or that it does always adhere to that, but it's always very grounded feeling, in my opinion.
It's tangible. You can grab onto it in theory.
I think in terms of the role-playing game, this is probably more present, and Troy and I have a shared opinion of that might be controversial to some people, but I'm going to flat out say it. Warhammer Fantasy role-playing, Warhammer Fantasy as a setting, is a better setting for a role-playing game than a war game, and Warhammer 40,000 is a better setting for a war game than a role-playing game. Now, that's not to say that you can't do both, but from a narrative perspective, the scope of these feels very different, and it has to do with the scale of the setting. Warhammer 40,000 feels really impersonal.
Absolutely.
And so having huge armies clash on planets and whole planets be destroyed, it just kind of goes along with that. And it's a good fit for epic space battles. And it's very hard to believe yourself to be one person in that world. It's not impossible. I do find in a lot of cases, and this is not necessarily a bad thing, it tends to degenerate into humor a lot of the time. No detraction. But when you play Warhammer 40K as a role-playing setting, it can be quite stark and sincere, but there's always this looming vibe of it being so ridiculous that it would have to be funny. It reminds me of games like Paranoia.
Right.
It's so over the top that it's hard to maintain it on an individual character level. Not impossible. Whereas Warhammer Fantasy feels the complete opposite to that, in my opinion.
Indeed.
I find that the role-playing game and the novels work better as narrative devices than the war game, which, if you think about these empires that are barely struggling to keep authority over their own lands, mustering huge armies of monsters and wizards and stuff to blow each other apart in impossible locations, you kind of balk a little bit when you take a step back and look at it, and you're like, wait a minute, how could these things be happening all the time?
Yeah, if you have the volume of weekly battles as implied by the lore and the very notion of a club-centered war game, right? A universe that could support that notion, that level of, we're battling, it would completely unravel the social order of the Warhammer Fantasy roleplay setting, which is the best part.
Yeah, I feel that the best compromise to this was Mordheim.
Mordheim's a really good compromise. It's a good read.
Because it's more like mercenary bands.
Yeah.
You can see these sort of dogs of war going off and trying to loot and plunder a destroyed city without it gnawing away the reality of the situation. And there's always this idea of this, some factions like the Skaven having the impending overflow because their populations are so vast.
Yes.
Or the undead. But I feel that the game is almost perfectly fit for role-playing because it has this grounded, gothic, grim, dark horror.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that they must have realized when they wanted to make a more brutal I don't know if this emerged organically, but some part of me likes to believe that they made Warhammer Fantasy roleplay a little bit more hardcore in the consequences of combat than, say, Dungeons and Dragons might have been unadulterated. And they began to realize that when you're writing adventures for this, they can't be combat focused.
No.
And so the game naturally, I think, may have evolved along those lines, where it became more of an investigative, intrigue, political game that's punctuated with combat and very brutal combat.
That rhythm is so enticing because as a GM, you're not just piloting these like brain dead monsters that are going to get slaughtered by your heroes. You're engaged in plots. You're engaged in manipulations, and you're trying to see, like, are the players going to crack this code, solve this riddle, and see what's really happening? And you can even do things like, we'll call it off-camera movement, where you're having the machinations of your villains or your different factions or parties play out, and there's meaning behind it. It's not quite just like, oh, we're all thieves guilds and we're all trying to thieve. There can be much more depth to the interactions between the parties and the factions, and the setting just not only encourages that, but gives you the tools as a game master to do that, which is so much more rewarding than just sword bashing.
Yeah, it's not a good system. I mean, I don't know if I mentioned this in the last one, but I don't want to dig too much into the system because we already talked about it.
Right.
But it's not super appropriate for doing a dungeon crawler. Now, I'm interested to see what you can do with that format in that game.
Mm-hmm.
But I think you'd have to handle it a little differently. I think it would definitely ratchet up the intensity, but the idea of going into one encounter after another and expected to survive or even be, viable, and like it might actually be really fun to do, but it would be a very different feeling than D&D.
100% it would.
So let's talk about the origins of this setting from the historical point of view. So it initially developed out of Dungeons and Dragons, effectively. But one thing that I like about this setting is that it very much takes it's very Eurocentric. And I don't mean that in the sense of like just the trappings of that. It's definitely written by people who have a sense of European history. It is an alternate Earth setting.
Yes, I agree.
I'll be straight up about that. It never explicitly, but like, find a world map and tell me that doesn't just look like a weird version of Earth.
Yeah, and even the nations, in some respects, broadly, can be transplanted onto European nations in a lot of ways.
Yes, if you ignore the boundaries of time.
That being the essential component to how this all works, though, right? As you'll probably explain.
We'll take the perspective that the game takes of the world, which is through the eyes, effectively, of the Empire.
Yes.
Which is an analog for the Holy Roman Empire. And it sets the time period for that as such. What can be said about it? So it has all those same components. So they have an elected emperor by elector counts. The separate states, the provinces of the empire, are always kind of at odds with each other, but somewhat cooperative. One of the great themes that I remember being more emphasized in the 80s material and somewhat into the 90s was the idea that despite its pretenses, the empire is quite a lawless place.
Yes.
There's a bigger emphasis on incompetence. And this sort of ties to the idea that when the setting was being made, this was like the cynical 80s of the UK. So this is like the falling apart of industries and Thatcherism and all this other stuff.
Yeah.
And it was paralleled alongside things like 2080 magazine, which is effectively a British punky version of Heavy Metal magazine, which is American but started off as French, almost around the same time. This setting is born out of this kind of rebellious, nothing works, and you can revel in the brokenness of it, but more as a matter of desperation and not so much as a matter of like, oh, it's a good thing.
Yeah, it's not quite so like, it's not a party, you know? The only party that there was Mordheim, and look how that ended.
Right. So we'll try to get through the human the human areas as fast as quick as possible, and then we can jump to the other fun stuff. So yes, you have what is the Empire, and that is effectively the Holy Roman Empire analog. To the west of that, you have Bretonia, which is a very backward place. But this is the cool thing, is like when you look at it, it's like, oh, it's chivalric knights or chivalric knights that are like doing the King Arthur thing, but they also have an extremely hierarchical society with like dirt peasant caste, and they have a very weird religion that involves worshiping a lady of the lake, which is interesting. And also the fact that they seem to exist in a totally different time period, but that they do so culturally. Because one thing I forgot to mention about the Empire is that the Empire has strong affiliations with dwarves.
Right.
And dwarves are known for their craftsmanship. And the Empire is more liberal on the idea of technology. And so there are like Da Vinci-esque tanks, and the dwarves have like flying machines and
steam engines. Heck, they got it all, the dwarves.
They have steam engines. The dwarves verge into the steampunk almost territory. I wouldn't call it steampunk. I would say that it's more couched in Da Vincian Renaissance. I think later editions kind of bleeded a bit more into a 19th century feel.
They do.
I tend to like the idea that it's a bit more restrained in that respect, because steampunk is a whole other thing. And it fits better because I would say that the time period for the Empire is more Baroque. It almost goes as far as to feeling 18th century, but it also has these sort of Elizabethanisms. I don't know what the term for that, but it feels like Elizabethan England at times, and then it also feels like, rural Germany at other times.
Well, that's one of the things it manages to really to balance well, is sort of like a rural folksiness with that more complicated class hierarchy that also exists. Like if you think about it in the game context, there's the different coinage tiers, right?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Thinking about that more in the lore sense or the narrative sense, it's like that is such an interesting way to look at that world, because in some places, like in the cities, in the capitals, that is what matters. But if you go to some of the more remote or rural areas, it flattens. And the setting accounts for that in the way that it speaks of the different people and the traditions of them. Like it even goes into harvest traditions for people who live in the more in the outer communities, the farmlands, right? The townlands. And that's so interesting. And the cities, you have more of that, like you're saying, that sort of later century sentiment where it's more like class driven, and there's more like not an industrial revolution happening, but the class tension thereof is sort of starting to come together.
It's pre-industrial at its very farthest limit.
Yes.
There's even these weird, I don't even know if I can even call them anachronisms, because the time period is so peculiar, but there are firearms.
Yes.
But they range all the way from like hand match lit cannon style, either handguns or full armaments, all the way up to like flintlock weapons, and including things like spring-loaded matchlocks and probably wheel locks. I don't see a lot of them, but they probably exist. And then it goes all the way into like fully advanced flintlock weapons. Dwarves even have things like rapid fire weapons.
Or flamethrowers.
Or Skaven have versions of these things.
Less safe versions, we'll say.
Sure, yeah. As to their nature, they have things like flamethrowers and Gatling guns that may result in their own demise. I find it interesting that the justification is cultural, not based around progress. It's the idea that like dwarves and Skaven fiercely covet their technology even from each other.
Yeah.
Right? So the idea that high tech exists, but it's like the brainchild of one dwarf or some very small Skaven faction within, usually Scryer, but
yeah,
also like just even within that clan, it's probably like they're keeping their secrets.
Yes.
Technology is so sought after in some respects, and then if you go to places like Kislev or Bretonia, it's totally disregarded. It's almost considered weird, or in Bretonia's case, it's like evil.
Yeah, it's immoral. Like if you are a gun user, you're not only a coward, but you're like a perfidious coward. Ooh, you're a cur. Ah,
Archer peasant levies are the range fighters of the Bretonnians, who prefer to get up close and personal on a horse and consider anything other than doing this, or maybe sword combat on foot, as being beneath them.
Yeah.
I just like that sort of cultural idea. So, and then I mentioned there's Kislev, which is Slavic Europe.
yeah, super Poland.
Could go as far as to call it Russia. It's a bit more textured than that.
I agree with you.
It's ostensively Russian and Polish.
Yeah.
In its feeling, though there's a city called Prague, spelt differently. Well, okay, they turned two of the letters around.
Yeah, they did.
They swapped two of the letters, or they rearranged the spelling. And I'm sure in some language, that's how Prague is actually spelled. But in any case, it's basically a hardier, tougher people. Then you have the Norse. No illusions of what that refers to.
Exactly.
Across the Sea of Claws, which is the northern ocean area, there is effectively fantasy Scandinavia. And then this will tie us into chaos and its presence. So chaos is obviously a borrowed concept from, I guess you could say that Poul Anderson kind of has, that's where we get things like alignment from.
Yeah.
But in this case, in Warhammer generally, and fantasy in particular, it's very much taking from the Eternal Champions of Moorcock, that kind of chaos, like cosmic, like an almost personified force of chaotic energy. Chaos is really interesting. It's kind of the secret sauce that makes the whole world kind of glow. And it ties into things like magic and mutations, and it just adds this taint to everything that almost turns Warhammer Fantasy as a setting into a kind of, and this is an important thing to keep in mind, or at least something that I find is very informative, which is it's almost a thought experiment about evil. So we noticed that there are like witches and witch hunters in the setting.
Yes.
The witch hunters look a lot like Solomon Kane. At least not all of them, but the ones that are the poster children for said profession. I mean, I think Solomon Kane is definitely an influence, but there's a cultural keystone for Warhammer Fantasy that I think gets overlooked frequently. I certainly haven't seen anyone refer to that. And this is, if anybody knows what this means, but I will go in as far as to explain it, but you'll get, hopefully you'll get what I'm saying, is the folk horror trilogy, which starts in 1968 and goes to 1961, and it's made up of 3 films. And if you watch these films, particularly the first and the third one, you will strongly suspect that the people who made this setting and these games watched those movies and really liked them. So they are Witchfinder General, 1968, The Wicker Man, 1970. Oh, sorry. That's 1973. Sorry. 1971's Blood on Satan's Claw. That's what Warhammer Fantasy roleplay probably should feel like if you just remove the Christian religion and replace it with Sigmar.
You're doing that a lot.
The clothing is exactly right. The time period's right. Everything about it. The fact that the Puritan landowner leaves his farmstead with all the kids who are clearly getting involved in some kind of chaos fertility cult, goes away, and then the next time we see him, he's holding a 2-handed sword and going, like, basically slaying what looks like a beast man-like demon.
That's perfect.
I can't overemphasize how much of an influence I think this movie was. And then, as I said, The Wicker Man, which is more subtle because it's set in modern times, but it has this idea of this sort of lurking current of rural paranoia about it. And I think these movies are pretty influential on this setting and on chaos as a concept, along with the obviously Moorcockian ideas of cosmic
order versus chaos, that tension.
Yeah, this sort of metaphysical, made physical idea.
That's really interesting because I'm much more familiar with the Moorcockian take, but those other films sound interesting and like they give some context that would be good to have if you plan on running it or if you're going to be thinking about the setting in a more elaborate way.
The thing that I think is important about Witchfinder General, which is a weird movie with Vincent Price in it, one that Vincent Price thought was too gory and violent not gory and violent. I'm sure he may have objected to that, but like it was a bit too sadistic. But it really delves into the themes of corruption. So like there's this idea in the setting around witch hunters not necessarily being the most legitimate people, right?
Absolutely.
And I feel that theme is literally taken right off of Witchfinder General and just thrown in, as there are so many other pop cultural things in not only this setting, but in the 40K setting as well.
I think we're pointing out something here about this setting that is easily missed, but in the role-playing setting of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, it's a horror setting. I think that's fundamental to it.
Yeah, and as we were saying, like the way that most, or at least the best adventures are built, they're kind of built around these intrigue plots of something lurking in the woods. Again, much like Blood on Satan's Claw or The Wicker Man.
Or a lot of Call of Cthulhu, right? Like a lot of Call of Cthulhu adventures of like, what's in the swamp? How do we even deal with it? You know?
I think it's a useful heuristic, but not actually true to refer to Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay as being a Call of Cthulhu fantasy setting.
Yeah.
I think that's helpful maybe for new people to kind of get, like if they played Call of Cthulhu and they played D&D, that they could kind of think of them as a weird fusion. I don't think in practice that's actually that accurate. I think there's a lot more nuance going on.
Yes.
But it is a helpful starting point for some people to kind of imagine the world in that way, because that's going to get the play style down. I find that the game is really hard to teach to players that only have played D&D, because they think that they are more heroic and powerful than they might actually be. Old school players like Gen X and older probably aren't going to have that problem, even if they've never played it before. If I just say, look, this is a pretty gritty and grim, they'll grok it, because D&D used to be like that too. It's different, but near to it.
I think also it has the problem for players wherein it's like Call of Cthulhu, where skills that do not seem valuable to a role player are so valuable in this game. Like it's the classic logic where, why would I take accounting in Call of Cthulhu? I'll take machine guns. And it's like, well, you're never going to get a machine gun, but you're going to have to audit this guy to find out if he's sneaking money to cultists. So, And I would say that same logic very much applies here, in the way that like knowing how to interact with the world in a meaningful way with your skills is so valuable, and much more valuable than just like, got the biggest sword, let's go.
I think one of the difficult things about it, and I don't know that 4th edition does a super successful job of making this as clear as 2nd edition does, is the idea that it's a very specific place with very specific characteristics around all of its components. So like in Forgotten Realms, if you're playing a dwarf, the description of what a dwarf is can range varying lengths of detail, but could very easily just be summed up as like whatever it says on the player's handbook plus whatever additional setting specific material. But it's short. Playing a dwarf in Warhammer Fantasy is a lot more of an investment into mindset.
Yes.
I almost don't let anybody play another race unless they've really understood what that means in this world. In D&D, I don't care. I'm like, you have a stereotype of what a dwarf is like in your head, just play that. That's fine.
Yep.
Or you know what an elf is supposed to be like? Sure. But because there's so much fictional content in the Warhammer Fantasy setting, you have to play them in a very particular way, or at least be able to get the cultural references that they're based on. Like, for instance, elves. Elves are, I mean, they are a bit like Tolkien elves, but I would argue they are more like Paul Anderson's elves, or they're more like the Melnibonéan from Moorcock. They have this thing that both of those versions do that I don't see that often. Elves in Tolkien are very elevated and almost out of reach.
Yeah.
Whereas elves in either Paul Anderson's work or in Moorcock's equivalent, which I would say are the Melnibonéans and Elric, they have these qualities that show up in Warhammer elves, where because of their long-livedness and their very weird emotional architecture, they'll do things that will seem almost inappropriate. My favorite example of this is in the novel Giant Slayer, where you're getting the inner monologue of Teclis while they're in a fight with some orcs and goblins.
Oh.
It's almost like if you're playing an elf, they almost have this level of self-awareness that's happening while the moment is happening at the same time. So that I can't remember what he was thinking about. Something about his ability to use a sword and the strange love of battle. And then he starts laughing and then realizes that all the humans and dwarves are like, what?
Oh, that's interesting.
Elves have this like self-awareness that makes them weird.
There's something about the races or species that make these characters not just a human alternate, but as a completely different entity. And if you want to get a meaningful role-playing experience with them, like you really need to think about what would make these dwarves be these dwarves, as opposed to like, I guess I'm a grumpy human.
Yeah. And it's deeper because it's been written as such.
Yeah.
Not that you couldn't get away playing a grumpy human and then that would be a dwarf, but that there's more to the internal motivations and traditions of dwarves, their religion. Like you almost have to make an anthropological study of the race that you're going to play. Dwarves are probably the most supported, then elves, and then I guess halflings and ogres would be. But there's enough about them that you could kind of get a sense.
And I would argue halflings are the least biggest jump, to have to make.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. They do have a very specific culture, though. Once you start digging into it, you're like, they're almost like humans, except they have this very familial clannishness about them that almost prevents them from becoming a functioning society, but doesn't, because they have at least familial loyalty. But they are notorious for stealing and ripping people off.
Yeah.
But when you look into it with some depth, you realize they don't do this to just anybody. They just do it to most people. They don't gel well with any other species in that world. Oh, that's another important thing to mention. Not that there haven't ever been written versions of these, but effectively there are no half races in the world.
Right.
They are actually different species. I know that obviously in like the early editions, they talk about like half elves and there's even heroic characters that are that, but they kind of phase out. And I almost like that idea. It's weird because it was controversial in D&D recently when they took out the half races and things like that.
Right.
And I thought in that case, it was weird because they had always been there and they've always been explained as this is why it's a valuable role-playing opportunity to be able to play a half elf or a half orc and what that means. But I almost like the idea that even if these different species had an original origin point, they've actually evolved so differently that they're not interchangeable in their breeding ability.
That's really interesting. There is so much of a distinction between the species and the races and the different like factional identities, if you want to be as vanilla as that, to like explain them as like coexisting, absolutely. But to explain them as being able to share like the same, like, oh yeah, we're basically the same thing biologically. Like I don't think that is the case in this setting because they are just like so different. And that is such a value to those characters because in that difference, there's so much that you can use for role playing to explore. And they have recently, and I mean, we could talk about this too. Perhaps this is a part of the fault we identified in our last episode, but there are specific source materials now for both dwarves and elves. So you can really dive into what that would mean to role play them. And I think what's really important is like not to limit yourself. It's like, I want to play a dwarf. I don't want to read 200 pages. Like not to think like that, but to think more in the capacity of like, okay, if I'm going to be a dwarf, what do we know dwarves care about? And can I have this character care about those things? And I think that's when you're doing the right, to quote, right thing.
Yeah.
When it comes to approaching the way this game expects you to role play a different species than a human, right?
Yeah, for sure. I'm glad that they came out with source books for these.
It's important, I think. I would love to see like more of that for the human identities too. Like a Bretonian source book would be kiss, like I want that.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, second edition had it, so let's just read that.
Yep.
But to say that, like, getting that material again, getting it refined for the current edition will be really nice. It might not be as entertaining a take on that, identity as maybe the second edition one is. So that would be an interesting apples to oranges comparison, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
But I do feel like that's something about this setting is like, it's less about you. It's more about the character, because in D&D, a lot of times you're playing a fantasy of yourself, right? But there's a lot more theater to the fantasy role play where you're taking on the role of a character and you're playing them. It is, I'm not going to say this to be a pretentious person, but it's a little more Shakespearean in the way that you're like on the stage, It's
more theatrical for sure. Yeah.
And I love that. I mean, like, I'm the kind of guy that loves that anyways, but that to me is part of the appeal to taking on a character in this setting, is that there is a character to take on. It's not just like, I guess it's the version of me that's not afraid to say no, and I got a breastplate on now. Like, you know what I mean? It's not that.
I feel it extends to even not just how it affects the character that you're playing a specific person from a specific culture, but also how those cultures interact with the world, like the way that they manifest, like the fact that, and this is something in our modern age I don't think we have a very good example of. I mean, it exists, but like cultures that are, I think let me change this. It exists, but our Western perception of these things is not as on point as it probably was in the past, which is the idea that some cultures are really different. They value very different things. And I appreciate that is a quality in Warhammer, because it makes those places feel more real and distinct. And it makes it more of an exercise of getting into the headspace of playing somebody from Kislev, Bretonia, Araby. I wish there was an Araby source book, because there's so many things about that place that I think are fascinating that don't get enough explanation. That being the southernmost human kingdom.
My historical footnote on Araby was they had a 10mm War Master army. Why? No one knows.
That is interesting. I did not know that.
Yeah, there you go. That's the only time they ever had miniatures was that. So there you go.
Were there rules associated with any particular supplement or?
In the War Master, whatever it was, Fanatic magazine at the time, Right.
So the historical sort of equivalent.
Yeah. So it's interesting, but yeah. Kind of wild that was the thing, but you're right. Araby would be fantastic to look at. Something you've talked about before is their magic system being really interesting. I could see that being like a whole supplement's worth of stuff. Someone else I would really like to see more of too would be like, give me a book about okay, this is a tough ask, but I kind of want a sandbox book about the Border Princes. Second edition had one, and I would love just like a book of like, here's some Badlands and go do some bad stuff to make yourself a prince. I would love a book about that.
So this is my argument about using second edition in fourth edition, because they're so mechanically similar. You have to obviously compensate for some of there being more stats in fourth and stuff like that. But I feel like because you have that in second, you kind of already have that in fourth.
Yeah, that's not bad. That's not a bad point.
And I think that, as I said, tonally, I tend to prefer second edition. I like the believability that fourth brings to living in that world, that it's not so bleak that you're like, well, why does anybody bother anyway?
Yeah, exactly.
Because I do think there needs to be some of that. I think there has to be some places in the world where you can just live what seems like a normal life until it's upended by, I don't know, beastmen or something.
Yes.
Because that's how I think about it. I feel like it's normal and you know that there are bad things lurking in the woods and you basically pretend those aren't happening until you can't. That's, to me, how the setting should feel. Oh, here's another interesting cultural affect that I thought was interesting interestingly different from, say, Dungeons and Dragons interpretations. So like Dungeons and Dragons, there are different kinds of elves.
Mm-hmm.
But unlike Dungeons and Dragons, those differences are entirely cultural.
Yes.
So there are dark elves, but they don't look any different from other elves, except maybe through what they wear and how they behave. And it's funny because it's reinforced in the sense that even within elf culture, they don't think of them as different either. I mean, they call them their dark kindred or whatever euphemistic term they'll make, but they don't make as huge a distinction between wood elves, high elves, and dark elves as other species or races do looking at them.
Yes.
And I thought that was really interesting. I thought that was like more distinct. Also that like they don't have this elementalist kind of viewpoint of them where like dark elves live literally underground.
Right. Yeah.
They don't. They just live in a different continent, effectively.
Yeah.
Or they live in floating sea fortresses where I just don't understand how that. I know where that reference comes from, though. That is a Moorcock thing.
Yeah.
That is the Melnibonéan war barges are literally lifted out of Elric and just dropped into the Dark Elves in Warhammer Fantasy. Like, look at those descriptions in Elric, and you're like, yep, that's the same thing, except bigger, because of course Warhammer has to make everything bigger.
The only way it works, yeah. The shoulder pads through to the spears, through to everything, through to the hand holding the spear. Take that, Dark Elf sculpts.
I know, right? Yeah. And clearly all the way to the point where, yeah, these giant war barges turn into floating islands. It's important to point out some like apocryphal like misgivings of the setting and things like that. So like there's no explanation of the Dark Elf economy at all. Aside from raiding, it doesn't really make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Unless it were very magically focused, which it might be.
That's the thing about like most stuff outside of the Empire does immediately start to lack the same level of grounding as you find in the Empire. And that's something I would level at the setting as perhaps a criticism.
Yeah.
Is the level of investment in the Empire kind of suggests you should be there in your storytelling before you go anywhere else. I mean, you can go other places, certainly, especially with second edition materials in hand. But what you can do in the Empire is just full of so much character. It's so detailed that if you were to go to, say, Bretonia, all of a sudden you're like, well, I know it's different, but I don't really know what they're doing.
Like in a broad stroke, like you culturally know in a lot of detail how they're different, but you don't know what it's like to be in that particular province or that particular city.
Exactly. And you'd be homebrewing that, which is the old tradition that we all have our roots in, but it's also a lot of work.
Especially with this particular setting.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's the idea that the Empire has so much detail baked into it that you almost feel like you have to live up to that level of detail if you're doing something abroad.
Yes, I get that. Because you wouldn't want it to all of a sudden feel like you load a new section of the map in a video game and there's like 3 icons compared to the previous 13. Like, what is this?
Yeah, exactly. And it's intimidating to take your story outside of the Empire. It's fine enough to bring things from outside in, because then you can use the structure of that and you can have, Bretonian like bandits and stuff like floating in and around, or, Kislevite mercenaries, that kind of stuff.
Yep.
Kislev isn't too badly described, but it definitely does not warrant the level of detail that the Empire gets.
Yeah.
Some places definitely take advantage, Norska is almost benefited by the fact that it's not well explored.
Yeah, true.
And because it's mostly a wasteland, it can make sense. Because there's the idea that if you go past a certain point, basically away from the southern coast, chaos is so prevalent that the landscape could be changing constantly.
Yeah.
You have to go pretty far up there, though. Yeah, one of the things I want to dig into that I think is an excellent example of the setting's uniqueness is the magic and how magic works.
I agree.
And the fact that it's very peculiar in the way that the setting is peculiar. Like, I think that's one of the things, my favorite thing about the setting broadly is that it doesn't care at all whether it connects to any game. It feels very internally consistent in spite of everything, even when it's being inconsistent, strangely enough. So that, like, as I said, when we were talking about the mechanics of Warhammer Fantasy roleplay, being a wizard is a very specific profession with a very specific subset of roles if you're human. And it's not just some random class that you pick. You were socially very peculiar to everyone else. Or if you were playing a witch or a witch hunter or like a dwarf slayer, as I used in the example of the other one, it's like these are not equivalent roles with each other that you could just pop in and out of anytime you feel like.
Absolutely.
I was even thinking about this after the fact, because we were talking about once you get into the slayer profession, you can't leave it until you die, because that's the point of being in it in the first place. But that's also sort of true of wizards. Like, if a wizard decided that he was going to do something else, they'd still be pursued by the Empire for being magical, right? Like, you don't just stop being a wizard.
Good advice.
And so you are still technically imperial property in a sense, or you exist at the behest of the Empire. And while it technically might be possible for you to like move into another role, in terms of narrative, that wouldn't change much for you.
That's so interesting. Well, there's less freedom in some of the roles that exist in the world, but within those roles exists immense power, and it's a balance between those two factors.
I like that. And it also makes things like, oh, well, I'm a beggar to start off with. I'm like, yeah, you are like at the bottom of the heap, but you have the most flexibility of any character. You have nowhere to go but up. And so your arc is implied to be that.
Yes.
And you're not pinned down to being any particular thing. You can move into, and the idea of like, oh, well, I want to play a wizard. I'm like, do you? Because this is what this will mean in terms of story narrative verisimilitude for the setting.
Right.
Is you're always going to be viewed as being this very specific class. Doesn't matter what you do. I call it peculiarity, like very particular quality that seems quirky and asymmetrical, but adds so much life and realism to the setting. That's why I like it. And magic fits the same way. So the way that magic works, so in the distant ancient history of the world, there were ancients that effectively made the world as it is, and they had these portals located at the north and south poles, and then one day the portals exploded or something terrible equivalent to that happened, and chaotic magical energy started pouring out all over the place. And the ancient founders were like, well, I'm done with this, goodbye. And they left all of the beings that they had evolved and trained to just deal with the situation, and they all dealt with it in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
Chaos is just such a cool idea. Like, it's effectively a dimension of manifest will.
Yes.
This is how my favorite way of the fact that, like, there's always this question, well, do the gods exist? And yeah, they do, but they exist at the will and behest of their believers in some sense. And they also have their own will at the same time, which is really unique as an idea, and it implies so many things. So there's raw chaotic magic that just spills from the poles. And as it, I guess, rounds the curvature of the earth, it splits into these different types, 8 types, somewhat indicated by the 8-pointed star of chaos, and cultivated by wizards and sorcerers and other magic users, because when it's divided, it's safer. The elves, obviously being the masters of magic, they weave together the winds however they can manage. And because they so long lived and they're more magically attuned, they can do this however they want. But when they help the humans set up their magical system, they basically say, all right, you can only, just for safety's sake, you can only wield one of these per person.
Right.
So then you get these 8 specializations, which then adds another level of texture, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's so many weird things like in all of these little books. Like I remember finding in one of the second edition books talking about magic. So, there's warpstone, which is effectively physically solidified chaos, something equivalent to magical uranium.
Yes.
Well, there are physical manifestational elements of each wind as well. So that there's effectively like the beast wind, but it's in rock form.
I think it's called amberstone.
Amberstone, yes, that's it. And yeah, they're associated with different stone like emerald and sapphires and amethysts and stuff like that. And then, yeah, they can create material component pure magics, which I thought that I loved the idea. Well, it's like, well, if we have this, we could have this. And so there's this logical follow through that's always present in the world that's set up on the foundations of the setting as a whole. Oh, this was another point I was making to you. So this was the thought that I was having, is that in things like Forgotten Realms, the weave is described more like an extension of physics. So it's kind of like this constant property that you can tap into. And there are some consequences for messing with it, but it wouldn't call it dangerous unless you did something really silly. But it's thought more like gravity.
It's hard to break, right?
Yeah, it's hard to break, and it's way more fundamental and way more conveniently pervasive.
Mm-hmm.
In Warhammer, it's more like weather.
Yes.
With all the temperance with all the temperamentalness that goes along with weather. The magic of a particular wind might be blowing really strongly in a particular place, and that may be causing certain effects. Like, for instance, if the wind of death were blowing, it might randomly raise the dead or make ghosts visible.
Yeah. Oh, wild.
Or, beast wind starts blowing and all the animals get like huge.
Yeah.
Or maybe the emerald wind starts blowing and all the plants become semi-sentient or start growing incredible sizes. It's just like so many things to have in your GM toolbox that you could just build an adventure out, because effectively the world is pervaded by this magic is something between weather and radiation.
Yes, that's so good. It is. And I think like wizards are weather forecasters more than they are scientists.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Right? Like they have to work with like this with like a predictive sense, less like an absolute like, well, I do this, that, and this, and I can reproduce this spell. It doesn't work like that. You need to be able to read the winds of magic and then use your abilities. So it's got, I mean, in game terms, it's still spells that you are casting, right? We're familiar with how games work, but what the implication is for your character and narratively is just so interesting and satisfying to look at relative to something that's more rote. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. I also like the idea that spellcasters in that setting have very tenuous control over magic itself, that there's no spell levels or anything equivalent to that. In theory, you could cast whatever you want, but your ability to control that as it manifests is very much based on how ambitious your designs are. And things like spell components and, adding solidified power like magical dust.
Yeah.
Or taking advantage of a wind being present at any one particular time, it either increases your odds of success or it makes the situation more difficult. Like a high presence of Dar, which is chaos magic, will make casting really volatile. And it might make it more possible, but it might add, it's like, oh, well, I'm going to do a summon animal, like I'm going to summon a bear because I'm going to use the amber winds because I'm a beastmaster.
Yeah, yeah.
And there's a lot of chaos magic, and maybe I do that thing, but it becomes like a twisted bear of chaos that is like now rampaging around the battlefield, killing everybody.
Take that, dire bear. We got a chaos bear.
Yeah, right. It's just this idea that it's, as I said, I'm going back to that idea that it almost feels like a meditation on like evil, in the sense that So we have a historical, I'll use the witch example because I think this is the easiest. So we had historical witches in real life, and it turns out that was a travesty of superstition and paranoia, right? And then Warhammer takes that and they say, but what if they actually were magic?
Right.
And how does that change the conversation? And then you're like, oh, wait, a lot of witch hunters are corrupt and awful and zealous lunatics, and that doesn't make them very good.
Yeah.
But also witches are actually dangerous.
Well, part of the setting is like some of the Brothers Grimm tales given this animation, right? And that's what makes it so interesting, because it's almost like they could be thought of as like, we've said folk tale before, but like they have that origin, right? And it makes you think of the world in a different way. And it is intriguing because it's not necessarily like the most pleasant way of looking at the world either, where you're like, oh, wait a second. What if there are actual evil magics that could make the undead come up? And then what if your neighbor literally is trying to make that happen? What do I do? And it's kind of like creepy in a way, but that's, again, it's a horror setting. It's supposed to be about these unsettling notions that at times you have to confront with blade and torch, and it creates like a certain excitement and dynamism, and like where you're like bringing a torch to the shadow to cast out the villain, like it's cool, it's exciting. The setting will give you this. It doesn't just make you go into a dungeon to find a crate, and that can be super fun, but we're not doing that right now. We have something else, and I feel like it is a more rewarding ultimate product that you will get. You do use the word product, it's maybe not appropriate, but you know what I mean? Like your outcome in the campaign, whether you're a player or a game master looking to tell that story.
I like that it's at least it's seated in these it's a horror setting, and it's seated in these uncomfortable truths. And some of those are not even like normal they're not normal horrific things. They sometimes just feel like cultural affects that are uncomfortable. Like Bretonnian society is a really good example.
Yep.
I remember in second edition, it had this disclaimer about Bretonnian society being like this brutally patriarchal sort of thing. And that's true. But I also think that's a bit of a surfacey view, because if you look below the surface in that case, you realize that it's a brutal patriarchy that is also a secret matriarchy. That's running things from behind from the shadows to the benefit of the sorcerer damsels that actually control things in some extent.
Dare I say Bene Gesserit?
Yeah, there's that vibe about them for sure. And that's what I love about it. It's got these layers. It's like, oh, well, there's this backward, superstitious Lady of the Lake cult with like actual full-blown, Arthurian knights running around. And they treat the peasants like dirt, and they don't let their women do anything, like they protect them. But then if you look at their actual culture, the men are meant to do everything for the women, and the women are actually secret magic users. I'm talking about the nobles specifically, not just any person. If you have magic in your lower in Bretonnian society, they'll just kill you.
It's even darker than in the Empire, right? So, well, that's the thing about the setting is like, it's a grim, dark setting, so you got to strap your helmet on. It's gonna hit you with like those hard, uncomfortable realities of its setting, where magic is so dangerous that if someone has it, they're kind of like they're either, in one hand, an episode of The Twilight Zone where the little boy can control everyone's thoughts, or they're a walking bomb. And both of those are pretty volatile to have.
Usually both.
Yeah, they're usually just both. So it's kind of crazy to have one of those loose in your society, let alone potentially thousands of them at any one moment. So like, I understand the impulse in the settings context to have these authorities to deal with that. And I think that what the setting does a good job of is never losing sight of the corruption inherent in these institutions fundamentally. Like, there are bad witch hunters. It's not like, well, there are evil witches, so there are good witch hunters. It's like, no, there are bad witches, so there are witch hunters, but it doesn't make them good. And that is so interesting in its own moral complexity, we'll call it.
Yeah, it's the thing that I appreciate most is as I said, the specificity of the setting itself, but also the nuance and how it doesn't lean on any one thing being against another, but it also does a good job of explaining the nature of good and evil in spite of all that. Because you can see the wrongness in the witch hunter, and you can see the wrongness in the witch.
Mm-hmm.
And you can also see possibly the good intentions that either of them might have, even though they might act like terrible people, because that's sometimes how people end up being.
It's true.
There's so many crazy levels to that. I just like how unapologetic it is for what it is. I don't know that it may necessarily always be that. One thing that I appreciate, at least about 4th edition, is that they didn't rewrite any of that. They just don't bring it up as much.
Yes.
And maybe that makes the setting feel a little shallower, but at least they're not like rewriting or reinterpreting things out of existence. They're just sort of not making a particular point of that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I mean, if someone can find an example where they've totally reworked it to be more socially acceptable, if you will, I'd be really interested. I haven't yet have found that. Let's put it that way.
Well, and I think part of the appeal of grimdark or of horror settings is that they grate in some ways against your sensibilities to force you to think and engage with them in a way that you're challenged by. And the truth of the Warhammer Fantasy roleplay setting is you can take a historical perspective to it, but that only gets you so far. Because magic is real.
Yeah.
And it's more than just, oh, it's Earth with funny countries. It's like, no, it's alternate Earth where magic is like a wind blowing through the street that can change you. And if it does change you, what does that mean for you? And what does it mean for your life? It's crazy. I find the thought experiment of the Warhammer Fantasy roleplay setting very convincing to me as like, oh, this is one of the best places to roleplay right now.
That's what won me over.
Like there are other settings you can get really deep with, right? Like if you want to do a super deep mythic fantasy One Ring story, right? Like that's super valid. Or if you want to do like a kind of more of a over the top steampunk, have fun and just kind of relax with your friends, you could easily do that in a D&D or many other systems, right? Like there's so many other options, right? But I'm saying like if you want to get into an actual playing of a character, like the role play part of the hobby, this is right in there with the Call of Cthulhu's of the world. And we made that comparison earlier, but that's where this stands. It's in that category. Mm-hmm. And that to me strikes a personal chord of interest. So I'm always down to run this. I've run 2nd and 4th. I've never played it, which is funny, but I plan to play it. And it'll be great when I do. I've already rolled up a very bizarre character, but it'll be super fun to dive in.
Yeah, I think you're suited to sorting that character out.
Yeah, it'll be fun.
We'll have some comedic misadventures. And that's another thing. It makes total room if you want to have a very silly situation happen. But it still has that grounding behind it, which is nice.
Mm-hmm.
It feels well considered, well conceived, a little messy at times, but not necessarily. I like that it leans into that messiness and tries to make it feel, I mean, it almost has the assumption of a science fiction setting in that it leans into the what if.
Yeah.
You know, and it often, when it's doing its best, it's carrying that off. You know, it's taking the implications that might be implied by its setting, and instead of saying, no, don't worry about that, it's like, yeah, what does that mean? Mm-hmm. And then it will open a door to something else. These are all the reasons why I think it's an investment.
There's lots of books or PDFs and lots to read.
Yeah, like I don't think it should be anybody's first dive into an RPG setting, just in the same way that I don't think RuneQuest should be either. It's so dense that to feel like you're doing it justice, everybody at that table should at least feel like they understand their character in that world. Whereas if you were playing something like Dungeons and Dragons or Dungeon Crawl Classics or anything like that, you can just be whatever you are and kind of roll with it. And I like that the idea that both of these types of games exists. And this is an example of one that it being so specific makes it really believable and good.
Agreed.
So I know this was a bit of a ramble. That's kind of what these episodes might be. They are kind of equivalent to our Beyond the Book episodes. But I wanted to talk about stuff that you weren't going to get in like a lore video on like YouTube or something like that, where it's just a monologue explaining the historical events of a fictional place.
there's two ways to regurgitate history, right? You could talk about like the dates, or you can talk about the motivations behind those dates. And I think that's what we're trying to get at.
Yeah, so hopefully that gives people more of an example of what these episodes are supposed to be. And I hope that it provokes a lot of feedback and people's own ideas. And like, what do you like about the setting? Or what do you not like about it? Or what are some other settings that might feel like this? Or some references that you feel fit into that cauldron of ideas that we didn't mention? That probably will do it for now. But yeah.
For our next episode next week, we are going to return to wargaming, and in fact, a hot new war game, the long-awaited, hotly anticipated Chain of Command 2. Look really forward to going in on that. I've got about 7-8 games under my belt so far already, so I plan to give a really good breakdown, and the two of us will put that game through its paces.
And I look forward to that. It's obviously we're big fans of the original game, and you've been playing some of this, and it sounds promising. It sounds different, but like in a refined way.
Yeah, it's good stuff so far. So that's my preview, but it'll be really cool. And yeah, be sure to tune in.
Well, until then, everybody have a great rest of whatever part of the day you're hearing us, and happy gaming.
Happy gaming.
We hope you enjoyed delving into today's episode. A big thanks to all of you out there for joining us. If you want to continue the conversation, you can find us on Instagram and YouTube at Tales and Tactics Podcast, or on all popular podcast platforms. Join us again on the next exciting episode of Tales and Tactics.